Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the fifth and last edition of the Fundamentals of Land Protection. Glad you all could make it for this final one. You will now have your Thursdays free to do what you wish in July and August. We have Christa Collins and Sarah Wells here.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you all for choosing to be here. Final set of the series. That's exciting. I'm Sarah Wells. I'm the Conservation Director over at Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust. We are a regional land trust in north central Massachusetts. And I think I'm heading into my 14th year at Mount Grace. I started as an AmeriCorps member right out of college. And interestingly, despite having grown up in Orange, Massachusetts, a mere 5 minutes away from Mount Grace's office, I had never heard of Mount Grace, had no idea what land trusts were. So I was very fortunate to find out about a program at the time that was called MassLift. It's now known as TerraCorps, which may be hopefully familiar to folks. I didn't think I wanted to stay in this area, but the longer I'm here and working with Mount Grace, the more grateful I am for the opportunity to be doing this work in the community that I grew up in. Christa?
Thanks, Sarah. It makes me feel even older than I already felt to hear you say 14 years. But until last fall, I was the director of land protection at Sudbury Valley Trustees, and I was at SVT for 20 years. Doing land conservation work, and I see my old colleague Laura here. Hi, Laura, and my new colleague who I overlapped with for like a day, Samantha. So I've done a lot of land deals over. Oh, there you are. Hi, and a lot of land deals, and been involved in a lot of partnerships. So I hope that my experiences there will be helpful to all of you today. And I'm going to give you a kind of overview of what we'll talk about today. And we had, as I actually helped Rob and Barbara with Paul Catanzaro kind of brainstorm the topics for this series. And it was really challenging to try to figure out how to fit so much important information into a coherent series of webinars. So we have a lot to cover today: funding, partnership, documentation, and closings. But we hope we organized it in a way that will give everybody kind of a good overview. And then, if we need to at the end, we can sort of dive into more questions that people have about specific things. So we're going to approach today's webinar in three parts: building readiness and capacity to do good conservation deals, including building and maintaining partnerships, funding, and including how to use those partnerships that you've built to leverage funding for your projects, and then project wrap up, what happened before, during, and after closings. We have a resource list that we'll link at the end of the PowerPoint, and so everything we talk about tonight will be in there. We've also put together a bunch of templates that Sarah and I both used in our work, and we've shared those with Barbara, and so she'll send them out with the follow-up email that you'll get after the webinar. We will, as I said, we'll leave some time for questions and discussion at the end, but in the meantime, we'll pause between each of the three sections, so that if people have clarifying questions that they want to ask, please, raise your hand for that, or put something in the chat, and Julia will be monitoring the chat, and Barbara. So Sarah's gonna get us started talking about building capacity, and we'll take it from there.
Thanks, Christa. Okay, jumping right into part one. There are a lot of different things we could say and recommend when it comes to building capacity and readiness, but we tried to narrow it down to three key questions that we think warrant careful consideration in this category. So first and foremost, all the topics we're talking about tonight, we think fall pretty squarely into this category of project management. So we think it's good for everyone here tonight to have a really clear idea: what does that really mean for you in your role and in the context that you're working in? Secondly, how are decisions actually made, and who in your organization is expected to be making decisions? Because you as a project manager, have the opportunity to tailor information that's best suited to help those audiences make informed decisions as you go along. And then finally, we're going to talk a bit about how to work with an attorney, not if we should be working with attorneys, but how to do it, and some tips for setting up the relationship so there's really clear expectations. So getting right into that first question, I think everyone here tonight is well aware that it's absolutely critical to have a good understanding of the nuts and bolts of putting together a real estate transaction. We have to know what the steps are, but what gets layered on top of that are the nuances and the different approaches that your specific organization might want to take. There are probably existing expectations about what the various steps look like, how they're done, and who's involved in doing various pieces of project management. At Mount Grace, we tend to think of our projects in terms of phases, and that gives us a nice shorthand way to quickly communicate how far along in the development process a given project is. I love this document that we have that's the companion to the idea of having phases, because it spells out what are these phases and what's expected to happen in them. And I'm someone who likes to see everything laid out. And when I was first starting, this was basically like gold to me, because it's not only a good resource, it's also pretty easy to modify it into a bit of a checklist. The whole point is to lay out all the various steps that could come up in doing a particular project in a loosely chronological order. I say loosely chronological because in my experience, project management is not linear. There's definitely an expected arc that projects will take, but you'll find that it's very common for you to be doing lots of things simultaneously. So I like having the idea of a roadmap so I know what those things are that are supposed to be happening simultaneously. The other benefit of having a document like this is that it institutionalizes your organization's approach to doing project management, which is really nice, because then you're not just beholden to one person's brain or memory. The way that I think another thing I'll point out about this is it gives us helpful reminders about when we need board approvals, and it calls out right in bold font things that are tied to the Land Trust Alliance standards and practices. And I find that to be super useful the deeper that we get into doing projects. And the idea here is that it's not a static resource. We keep it updated as practices change and as we get new and better information. So you as a project manager, you're holding all of those pieces, but a key part of that role is knowing how to communicate about the project to your respective audiences. So I think everyone in this group today already knows that project management is about a lot more than just doing the right steps in the right order. You have to know who else is involved. So in any given project, at a minimum, that's the landowner you're working with, but it's also very likely to be a committee. In Mount Grace's case, we have a land committee, and we have a board of directors who, of course, are involved in all the projects that we're doing. So I think it's well worth the time to tease out at what point those various audiences are making decisions and how you can tailor your project information in a way that helps that group make a well-informed decision. So I just want to tease out one example of what I'm talking about. And we're going to look at an example of a project budget. And one of the resources that we have to share with you all is one that Sudbury Valley trustees put together for our sample budget. At Mount Grace, we have basically an Excel workbook. The first tab of the workbook is designed to basically be our all-in budget. We're trying to have a line item to correspond with any potential cost that could come up in the course of doing that project. There's a lot going on with this spreadsheet because we're also trying to think about the timing of when funding is coming through if Mount Grace needs to borrow money, if we're lending money out on behalf of a landowner, we need to place as project managers to capture all of that nuance. But this is way more information than our board members need to see. This wouldn't be a useful tool for them to look at on its own, and it definitely would be too much for our landowners to be looking at. So the way we've set this up is the project managers primarily use this tab, and from it, we've formatted other tabs that are designed to meet those audiences' needs, but it's all pulling from the same source information. Our board, for example, they really care about seeing a zero balance budget. They want to know that we have been thoughtful in anticipating the potential costs. We have an idea of what the costs are, and that we have a solid plan for covering those costs. Great. Our landowners, on the other hand, they might not necessarily care whether it's a zero balance budget. They might be glad to hear that. I'm sure they'd be take heart in knowing that we had a good plan for protecting their property, but the information that they are much more interested in seeing is how much is this project going to cost them? And if it does end up costing them anything, at what point in time are they expected to make payments, so to speak? And on the flip side, if they stand to be paid or to receive any proceeds from the transaction, how and when does that come into their picture? So the way that you come up with these tools could look different, but I'm offering this as just one example of how, as a project manager, you're holding all the pieces of the project, but that it's not necessarily useful or productive for you to share all the information with all of your audiences all the time. Like, your important part of your role is culling down that list of the folks you're working with, know enough to feel informed. You've figured out the interval of exchanging information, you know, the level of detail that they are expecting to hear from you. And some of that you just kind of figure out as you go and you form relationships, but it's well worth the time to figure that out. Okay, and our final readiness tip here has to do with working with an attorney. I know that you've all heard this before, and it came up last week with Cynthia and Olivia. We know that as conservation professionals, we're obligated to recommend strongly to the landowners we're working with that they obtain their own legal and financial advice, of course. But as conservation professionals who are trying to put together deals that will stand the test of time, we also have an obligation to make sure that we are getting our own appropriate legal and financial advice. So to that end, I thought it might be useful to point out a few key ways that at Mount Grace we work with our attorney, in case that's useful for you thinking through how your relationship is set up with your attorney. And ultimately, the goal is to have shared expectations for how you're working together. For some background, Mount Grace had one attorney for more than 30 years. And then right before the pandemic, he retired, which was a bummer because we loved him. But thankfully, he gave us a lot of lead time to plan for that transition, about a year actually. And he even introduced us to our new attorney. So he really helped to set us up for a smooth transition. And I get that that's probably an anomaly, and other organizations probably have a much more difficult time navigating, can have a more difficult time navigating those transitions. So I'm very grateful that that was our experience. And it was also healthy in that it made us pause and think about, okay, we're setting up this new relationship with a new attorney. How do we explain what it is that we do and the support that we need? And to that end, we've come a long way in kind of charting that out. I'll also note that we work with our attorney, this one attorney, on every land transaction we do. I think there's a lot of benefit to that because we can develop a really deep working relationship and understand what each of us are bringing to the table and build trust that extends from transaction to transaction. But I know that's not necessarily the case depending on where you're working. And that's also can be totally fine. But at Mount Grace, the first place that we're always working with our attorney is in setting up the title, which I know Olivia talked about a lot last week, which is great. Our attorney, he is always the one to choose the title examiner because he wants to feel very comfortable with the quality of work that the title examiner does. Once we have a title report, we review that report with our attorney and we collectively come up with a game plan for how we're going to remedy any defects that might exist. So for example, mortgages are pretty common. But outside of that, it's really Mount Grace, the project manager, who is then implementing that plan and communicating directly with the landowner about steps that they might need to take to address any issues with the title. And that extends to just the negotiation in general. We're doing that directly. And it's very rare for our attorney to have direct communication with landowners we're working with. That only happens if there's some unusual circumstance and it would really benefit the project to have him be more involved than he typically is. Same goes with setting up the overall conservation strategy that gets generated by Mount Grace, but we try to share that strategy with our attorney as early as we reasonably can. So usually at the stage where we're ready to order title, we feel like we have a project that's pretty real. So at that point, we're talking to our attorney about how we imagine the project is going to come together. That gives him an opportunity right away to flag whether this is something that is pretty standard or if there might be some places where we might need to bolster our plan a little bit for whatever reason. So bottom line, he has places to give input, but we're driving the process. As far as legal drafting goes, this might be different from how other organizations approach it. I'm not sure. At Mount Grace, it's the staff project manager who's doing the majority of the actual drafting. The huge caveat with that is that we're only able to do that because we have a strong relationship with the one attorney and we're using templates that he is either directly provided or that he's approved. So for the project manager, it's really more of a plug and play endeavor if we're using something like a purchase and sale or an option agreement. Anything beyond that, that's a deviation from the norm, might be a little tricky or complicated, then of course we're relying on our attorney to help us out with that. And then finally, we always work with our attorney on closings. He is ultimately responsible for doing all of the recording. He also handles and processes any funding that might be coming in or going out of the closing. I won't belabor this too much here because we will be talking about closings a fair amount in a little bit, but I tend to think of closings as a bit of a co-pilot situation where our attorney is the main pilot, but Mount Grace is right there as the co-pilot, and our job is really to tee everything up to make sure that we have a solid game plan financially and in terms of documents, and everyone knows what's going on and where the plane is going. But our attorney definitely lands it. Okay, so here we're gonna take a pause. I'm actually gonna stop sharing my screen for a moment. I'm gonna check to see if there are any questions. So there is one. I want to thank Julia Fitzpatrick. She's finishing her second year of TerraCore with Mount Grace, and she's been a participant in this series, and she's helping us track. She's pulling out questions that show up in the chat and putting them into a separate Google document. That way, if Christa and I don't get to answering all of them tonight, we'll go back and add responses so Barbara can send them out later. But the first question is a really good one from Carol. If you've never done a land deal, how would you know what steps need to be taken? Are there templates for these kinds of organizational tools? Yes, there's a lot on from the Land Trust Alliance, and I'd also be happy to share Mount Grace's phase document. I didn't get my act together in time to clean it up to put it in the resource list for today, but I can do that tomorrow or in the coming days, and that could be helpful. Christa, would you add anything to that?
The only thing I would add, and it's probably not as detailed as either the two resources you just gave, but the Mass Woods website, there are a lot of a lot of booklets and documents that are more geared towards landowners and helping them understand the process. But if you're new to land deals, I would say that's a great place to start to get kind of a general overview of like, how do we begin? How do we even start this process? And usually it starts with conversations, and then you can use the resources that Sarah mentioned to kind of get more into the nitty gritty of the actual transaction.
But that's a great question. I'm definitely on the side of trying to map out whatever you know and then figuring out where the gaps are instead of going in and being like, well, I think other people kind of know what's going on. I'll figure out as I go, because that might work, but there are a lot of specific requirements that we need to meet as land trusts and also even as towns. I think it's good to just have a place where it's spelled out. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen again and go back into the PowerPoint. Like I said, I'm going to start first with some quick tips for working with state grants, and I'll hand things over to Christa. Okay, so first and foremost, again, I'm talking about grants that are available through the Massachusetts Division of Conservation Services, of which I'm a huge fan. I think we're very fortunate in Massachusetts. There's a progressive, robust suite of funding that's available every single year. That is pretty cool. We're not going to get into the specifics of those grants, but Christa did put together a great spreadsheet that lays them out that will be in the resources, and the state's webpage is also very helpful. And again, just a couple quick tips. First, talk to the grant administrators. Right now in Massachusetts, that's basically Melissa Cryan and Vanessa Farney. They are both wonderful human beings, and they're also really helpful resources. The two tips for working with them I'd recommend are first, going to the information session. Every single time the state releases or opens up a grant, there's always at least one info session. It's really worth it to go, even if you're at the point where you've done a couple of applications and you get it, you know what the grant is all about. If you go to the info session, at a bare minimum, it gives you a sense of your potential competition because you can see who else is in the room, and that can be useful. The second way to kind of reach out to the grant administrators is to give them a call early on. So not the week that the application is due, but ideally even a few months out. You can brainstorm about your project with them. You can also ask them about previously funded applications that might be similar to yours, either in terms of project type or geography. And from there, you could then follow up directly with folks who've gotten these grants before. And I think this is a great example of the tension between, yes, grants are competitive, but big picture, in my experience, the conservation community in Massachusetts is so collaborative. And I've never come across someone who hasn't wanted to talk about their project, especially if they got the grant and it was successful. Usually people are eager to share what worked, what didn't, how they might set it up differently. So if you're open and have the time to make those phone calls, totally worth it. Second, read the bid document. I know everyone on this call is a professional. Of course, you would do that. Of course, the only tip that I would add here is that it can be useful to check out the current year bid document, but also compare it to the previous year bid document. It's pretty common that the state will kind of slip in new carrots, if you will, or incentives. And if you are able to pick up on those and have a good sense of what the current administration's funding priorities really are, then that can give you an edge when you're actually building your project proposal. And then finally, this is another piece that's right in there with the bid document. They include the ranking system for every single grant that's available. So our state is completely transparent about what they're trying to fund. They'll tell you exactly how many points they have to award and in what categories. So it is well worth the time to go through and conservatively do a mock ranking of your potential application. That'll tell you where there are strengths. It'll also give you a heads up, if you didn't already have it, about the potential weaknesses of your application. So you can either try to overcome them or bolster other pieces of your project. So those are those are pretty straightforward, but I think they're foundational pieces to spend the time working on if you can. And I'm going to hand it over to Christa to talk more specifically about strategy behind choosing grants.
Sure. And talk about sort of partnerships in general too, because typically if you're if you're using a partnership to apply for grants, that partnership is going to flow through the whole project. So it takes a lot more care and management than just getting through the grant process. So in some ways, every land project you do is a partnership, because there's always at least the landowner and the land trust, the one land trust doing the deal. But I found, as I kind of moved on in my time at SVT, that we were doing more and more deals with multiple partners, sometimes as many as 5 different entities working on one deal. And that's great. It just because it often means you can bring more resources to the table, more smarts, more feet on the ground, but it takes a lot more organization to make sure everybody's working and rowing in the same direction. So, but a typical project might involve a nonprofit land trust, maybe a municipality, and the landowner, or maybe you live in a part of the state where there's a strong state presence when it comes to conservation and do a lot of work with DCR, or Division of Fish and Wildlife. Maybe you even have done or going to do partnerships with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And I've worked, I think, with all of those entities over the course of my time at SVT. So, I think the most important thing, if I can stress nothing else, it's that the importance of defining roles and responsibilities. And it's not always easy to do that right from the start, because you do need to be strategic in thinking about who applies, who's the lead applicant on a grant, and who's the lead project manager. And there are a lot of things that go into making that decision. And sometimes it's not always clear right at the beginning what the best strategy is. So, a land trust can sometimes often be kind of great in just being sort of the lead project manager in terms of sort of corralling all the partners, but maybe the municipality has to be the grant applicant because it's a land grant or it's a municipal vulnerability preparedness grant. Sometimes it makes more sense for a state agency to be the applicant on the grant, but there are certain things that they're not going to be as adept at doing as the land trust would be. I will give you an example of that. We did a project towards the end of my time at SVT that was adding some land to Callahan State Park in Framingham. So we worked with DCR, and DCR and SVT had been talking to the landowner, simultaneously for years, and always staying in touch with one another, and finally got to the point where we had a deal put together, decided to go for a land and water conservation fund grant, which are not, those can be tricky grants because the timing can be a little bit uncertain. You don't have sort of a clear, fiscal year calendar like you do with the state grants. But for whatever reason, we decided that it made sense to go for a land and water conservation fund grant. DCR was the applicant, worked really closely with EEA, who then in turn worked with the federal folks on the grant. But in the meantime, SVT kind of stayed in touch with the landowner. We did a lot of outreach. This was right when the project started, kind of right when the pandemic hit, and we were able to really, I hate to use the word capitalize, but we capitalized on the number of people that were out walking the trails in Callahan to kind of put up signs, and we actually collected emails. On the signs we said, if you're interested in learning more about the project to protect this piece of land, get in touch. And so we developed this big email list of people that keep reaching out to. We got some great testimonials of people who use the trails and cared passionately about the open space in the park. So that was like one of my favorite partnerships, actually. And it was one of those projects where just everybody, it felt like it took a long time, and the landowner definitely got antsy, but in the end, everyone was just so happy, and it worked out really well. When it comes to, grants that the municipality has to apply for, like land and municipal MVP grants. The town or city has to be the lead applicant, but particularly with the MVP, there are a lot of pieces that have to go into that grant application. It's a more complicated grant application, I think, than the land grants. It's a great opportunity for the land trust to kind of say, hey, how about we help out with X, Y, or Z? And that might be doing some mapping. It might be gathering, ecological attributes about the property that can go into the grant application. We did a couple of MVP grants. The municipality turned to SVT to help with getting data on environmental justice populations and really fleshing out how are we reaching audiences that wouldn't normally be reached through these conservation projects. So kind of deciding early on in the application process who's going to be responsible for what sections, I think helps everybody, because it's most of them are too big a job for one person to put together. There's also the sort of there's a question of tact a lot of times when trying to sort of think about a hierarchy of activity on a project. SVT was tried to be very sensitive about not stepping on toes when it came to working in partnership with local land trusts. We tried to involve local land trusts on projects that we did in towns where there was one. Sometimes some of our leadership thought that we were a little bit too deferential, that we had really important skills that we could bring to the project, and maybe sometimes we needed to be more assertive in taking control of a project. But that's something that you're developing relationships over many, many years, and the most valuable thing about working with the local land trusts from our perspective, because we were a regional land trust, was having those local relationships, because you're partnering directly maybe with the local land trust, but there's so many other people that have to be involved in a community to make, when there is a municipal involvement in a project, to make that work. Maybe it's the town manager, maybe it's the finance director, and so having your local land trust already have relationships with those people is really important, and then knowing when to involve those people. So like I said, defining roles and responsibilities, everybody brings some strength to the project, and figuring out what those strengths are and how to deploy them is really important. And the earlier you can do it, the better. So another thing that we did more and more often as we were working with multi-partner projects at SVT was to have memoranda of understanding or memoranda of agreement and sometimes there were multiple agreements or MOUs on a single project, particularly where there's a fundraising piece and a private fundraising piece. So we would sit down with our land trust partner and say, okay, we have this big fundraising campaign. What's the goal? How are we going to do it? How are we going to collect funds? We're not going to accept gifts of artwork or cars. Who's going to be, how are we going to make sure that we appropriately credit each other and memorialize everybody's involvement? How are we going to acknowledge gifts? How are we going to share lists? Are we trying to reach the same audience, or are we reaching different audiences? Because often when we're working with a local land trust, we have overlapping memberships. And so that question of, do you share lists or not, can be very sensitive. And you just have to have that conversation and make an agreement. We always included something about how are the partners going to be reimbursed for out-of-pocket expenses, and when it comes to stewardship endowment, are we both collecting a stewardship endowment, or is one entity? Are we setting aside, are we reimbursing ourselves for staff time where we're a staff land trust and maybe our partner is all volunteer? So these are questions you really want to sort out at the beginning and put them in writing, because when you're talking about a 2-year project, nobody remembers what you decided in month 5 unless you've written it all down and signed at the bottom. And these were always documents that could be amended as time went on. And I think that was always the trickiest part is we would do the MOU and then it would take a long time and everyone would put a lot of effort into it. And we'd be like, yeah, that's done. You put it away and then you forget to look at it again until the very end. And then you're like, oh, it didn't really turn out exactly how we had envisioned it at the beginning. But hopefully your relationship is intact at the end of the project and you can work through any little changes that happened along the way. We have also done a lot of MOUs around sort of the post-closing MOU around co-held conservation restrictions and who's responsible for monitoring. As many of you might know, now when you have a co-held CR, the state requires that you designate a primary holder and a secondary holder. It used to be no one used to think about that. You just had co-holders and it was never really clear who was responsible for what and what happened if there was a violation, what happens if the parties don't agree on how to enforce a violation. So we always have now an MOU with the co-holding organization to make it clear who's responsible for what and what happens when there is a conflict. I'll give an example of another recent project that had multiple partners and multiple agreements. We did a project in Concord, and our main partner was the Concord Land Conservation Trust, and we were hoping to purchase a piece of land right in the middle of West Concord. The town got involved early on, not just the town natural resources department, but the community housing, well, the affordable housing entities in town, because there was already a small house on the property. So we ended up carving off an acre for affordable housing. So we had an MOU that had the Housing Development Corporation, the two land trusts, and the town. I think that was it. And then we had a separate MOU with just SVT and the land trust about fundraising. And then we have a third MOU with the land trust about co-holding the conservation restriction. In the beginning, we had a lot of discussions about who's going to own this land, who's going to hold the CR, who's going to co-hold the CR, who's going to apply for the grant. And we actually developed two different strategies based on the different grants and the reimbursement rates. And we ended up planning to apply for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and we were going to apply for a municipal vulnerability preparedness grant. And I can't reconstruct our thinking exactly, but for some reason we decided that if we got the Land and Water Conservation Fund, that the town would own the land and the two land trusts would co-hold the CR. And if we got the MVP grant, the local land trust would own the land and the town and SVT would co-hold the CR. We ended up getting the Land and Water Conservation Fund, so the town has now purchased the land, and we're still trying to finish the CR. It's my post SVT project that's still going, and even up until closing, because many of the grants, almost all of the grants, are reimbursable grants. There was a chance that one of the land trusts was going to have to step in with a pre-acquisition and put money up to buy the land and then be reimbursed once the grant came through. In the end, it turned out that the town had enough free cash to sort of prepay and get reimbursed directly. But that's another role that the land trust can play that's important to kind of think about ahead of time and memorialize appropriately. If you have a revolving fund, SVT, for example, has a revolving fund that we could use to pre-acquire properties when there is a time constraint, and we charge interest. So that has to be memorialized with a mortgage and a note. So a lot of things to think about in the partnership, and just when in doubt, put it in writing and have a lawyer look at it. So and I said, now Sarah mentioned that we were so lucky to have so many different funding sources, public funding sources in Massachusetts these days. So in terms of deciding which ones to go for, often the biggest driver is the timeline. The spreadsheet that I put together with the help of my former colleague Meredith, which will be emailed around afterwards, we tried to put when the application dates typically are for each of the grants, and then when you're typically notified. Putting oftentimes you have to work backwards. Let's say you have a landowner who's like, I have to close in a particular fiscal year. That might rule out some of the grants. It might rule out Land and Water Conservation Fund because you just don't know when that's going to come through. It might rule out the land grant because you just missed town meeting and you have to wait a whole nother cycle to go in. So the MVP grants are a little bit off the land grant cycle, and they have a little bit shorter timeline for turnaround of grant decisions, it seems like these days. So the best thing to do is to sort of start with the date that you need to end and work your way backwards and figure out what are the key dates that you need to think about to get that done. So I think we can go to the next slide. So this gets to developing a timeline and a work plan. So as I said, understand what your key dates are, not just for, not just the deadline that the grant application is due, but when do you need to, get your town meeting approval? When do you need to get all the signatures on you usually need the town CEO to sign off on a land grant. Make sure you have that well in advance of when the grant has to be submitted. You don't be scrambling for signatures at a time when people might be on vacation or something like that. So you got to leave plenty of time for signatures, knowing that if you have multiple people on your board that have to sign agreements, making sure that you know where everybody is and they're going to be available when you need them to sign. So having a really tight timeline once you decide what grant you're going to go for is a really important thing. The other thing that we've relied a lot on in the past, especially for more complicated projects where you have multiple partners, is a work plan. And I included an example in the documents that we'll share with everybody, but I'll use the example of a project that is actually almost, I think, is about to finish. And SVT was involved with, it was an orchard in Harvard, and partnership involved the Harvard Conservation Trust, Sudbury Valley trustees, the town of Harvard, Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources, because thank you, this was an APR. And then the owner of the land was another nonprofit, the Community Harvest Project. And Community Harvest Project had received this 70+ acre orchard as a gift, and decided that they wanted to sell a CR APR in order to sort of endow their operations, because it's very hard to make money on an apple orchard, especially when you give all your apples away. They're a hunger relief organization. So luckily MDAR, because MDAR doesn't always like apple orchards, but they like this one. So they actually gave a pretty sizable award to this project. But it was a $5 million cost for the total APR. So MDAR put in about half, and then it was up to the rest of the partners to raise the rest of the money. And happily, Community Harvest Project was an active participant in the fundraising, because we saw that one of the strengths they brought to the table was a really different fundraising audience. There were foundations that funded their work that we would never have access to because we're not a hunger relief organization, but because of that aspect of this project, they were able to bring in other grants that we couldn't get. So we had kind of divided it up, that SVT would go for a lot of foundation grants. Community Harvest Project would go for their particular foundation grants, and then Harvard Conservation Trust, who had a local audience, would be more in charge of the individual fundraising. So with all these moving projects across, I can't remember when we started. I think it was like 2015. And no, it must have been 2018, and it's gonna close this June. Oh, maybe it's gonna close tomorrow. I don't know. Laura, do you know?
It's done, it's complete, it's
Nobody told
protected.
me. All right, we'll have to catch up on that. Anyway, so over a really long period of time, it took for this project to come together, because if anyone has gone through an APR project, there's the whole state approval side of everything, and then it has to go down to the federal National Natural Resources Conservation Service to go through a whole process there. So what we did, and I know everybody doesn't love Google, but using a shared Google spreadsheet for this project was, I don't know how we would have managed this project without it, because we had a very detailed grant spreadsheet that everybody could fit in so that we knew who was applying to which foundations. We had a communications tab on our spreadsheet, so we could assign tasks to everybody. We would say, Harvard Conservation Trust was sort of in charge of getting articles in the local paper. SVT was in charge of getting the word out through our social media. So making sure that we had, month by month, kind of detailed communication plan was all part of this project management too, and giving people deadlines and assignments so you can kind of keep people on task. It was really helpful for us internally at SVT too. We had I think our whole development staff was involved in this project, and just making sure that, because we always had multiple projects going on at the same time. So I had to sort of trust our development and outreach staff to fit in these posts that we needed to get the communications out about this project in with all of the other things that they're communicating to our audiences. So it was a lot of moving parts, and we met, the main project team met, I think, every other week by Zoom for a really long time. But there was also staff turnover and board turnover, particularly at Community Harvest Project while the project was going on. So having our detailed spreadsheets made those transitions a lot easier, because it was easy to go back and say, like, okay, Tori's on maternity leave, so now Wayne's going to step in and take over her tasks. So I think that was a very, it ended up being successful. It also was really helpful to have that plan in place, especially the communications, because there was such a long timeline for the project. I just got an email from development staff last week saying, did we end up like thanking the donors when we hit the fundraising goal, or did we decide to wait until it actually closed? And I said, we decided to wait till it actually closed. So just making sure you get everything down in writing so you can refer back to that. And so everyone's on the same page with where you're going, it was really helpful. So I think that's all I have to say about that. I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah now.
All right, we're gonna talk about closings in a chronological fashion, things that need to happen before, during, and after the closing. And there are, I was trying to think of a way to categorize it for this presentation, and I just kept thinking there are different baskets of activities that need to happen. So if you're kind of a visual person like me, maybe it'll be useful to think about it that way. So first and foremost, on the project management side, as you're cruising toward a closing, again, hopefully you've already been in good communication with your attorney and you're on the same page in terms of knowing what the plan is for remedying the different title defects, if there are any. Hopefully you're already talking about the plan for documents. That includes documents that need to be recorded, such as a deed or a conservation restriction, a survey, a mortgage subordination. But it could also include other documents that you may or may not record, but that are important. So there could be a variety of affidavits that you might need to obtain and have signed. This is also, I think, a good reminder about municipal lien certificates. So that is something that the town produces to show that the property is up to date on the municipal property taxes. That's really important. And I always have to remind myself of this because we work primarily in small towns, and it's not guaranteed to work if we call up town hall the day before closing and try to get a municipal lien certificate, because these are small towns that there's limited capacity. Folks are already stretched thin. So we want to make sure we're giving external partners time to actually produce the documents that we need. That also relates to thinking about the budget plan, and in advance of a closing, having a really clear idea of where money is coming from, where it's going, and also the form that that money is taking. So are you looking at money getting transferred via wire transfers? And if so, do you have the wiring instructions? Are you looking at having physical checks at closing? If so, do people know who the check should be payable to and what the actual amounts are? What are your plans for handling that? And that can also relate to making sure you have a plan for collecting signatures. So sticking with the example of checks, at Mount Grace, there's a monetary threshold at which checks need to be signed, not just by one person, but by two people. And it's pretty low, it's $3,000. So that is helpful for me to have in mind early on to make sure that I know we have two people authorized to sign who are going to be geographically accessible at the time of a closing, which can actually be pretty important if you're looking at fiscal year end closings around June or calendar year closings around December, where people have lives outside of conservation and they sometimes want to spend time with their family and do things on holidays and go on vacation. So obviously we need to remember that we're whole people working with other whole people, including landowners, that we know how we're reaching people to get signatures. A little more signatures, they're the ones we need to think about internally. So if our board, president, treasurer need to sign conservation restrictions, great, we have more control over that timeline. We also need to bake in sufficient time for the calendars that we don't have any control over. So for example, the secretary of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs also needs to sign the conservation restriction. I would imagine most people on this call are pretty well aware that that's not an overnight proposition for the secretary. So we have to be mindful of that when we're setting up our projects, both for conservation restrictions, but just in general, as a project manager, you need to know what needs to be signed, who's doing the signing, and is there time to get all the signatures. Also very important to make sure that you have your board approvals in place in advance of the closing itself. That's a pretty big non-negotiable type item. So you need your board. I think this is true across the board, that for land trusts, board of directors need to approve the land trust acquiring an interest in land. So make sure you're aware of how often your board meets and that you've baked in time to get the approvals that you need. And heading into the closing is also a great time to take another look at both requirements for grants that you may have secured and also Land Trust Alliance standards and practices. On the grants end, I like to, even a month or so before closing, take a look again at what the reimbursement requirements are on the other end of the closing to make sure I'm really clear on what type of paper trail I need to produce so that I'm setting up that paper trail appropriately, leaning into closing. So that for example, you need to produce a receipt from the registry showing that you paid the recording fee. Like, great, that's a simple thing, but you want to make sure you know that before you go to the registry and you get that little piece of paper and you forget about it and it ends up smushed somewhere in your car. Like, there are kind of basic things you want to reinforce, make sure that you're putting together the right paper trail. On the Land Trust Alliance side, and I should say I have definitely accidentally smushed receipts in my car, but thankfully I was able to find them after. on the Land Trust Alliance side of things, it's good to review requirements on the due diligence side. So that's a lot of what Cynthia and Olivia talked about last week. It can also be a good time to dust off the record keeping policy and procedure that your organization has to make sure that you're doing what you can to prep for collecting documents in a fashion that'll make it easier for you to then follow your own record keeping policy after the closing. On the stewardship side, if you're doing a conservation restriction project, make sure your baseline is on track. And at Mount Grace, we always have those signed before the closing. So that can take a bit of coordination, and it can be tempting to silo thinking between land acquisition and stewardship, but there are some really key places where you can't really afford to silo them. They have to be integrated in your approach. And also recommend talking sooner rather than later with whoever's doing your stewardship, if that is in fact a different staff member or even a volunteer, to make sure that you know what they need in order to do their part of stewardship after the project closes. With your landowners, of course, you want to make sure that they are not in the dark about the timeline and that you have a good sense of what their expectations and their preferences are for the closing. Maybe they're really jazzed about the idea of going to an in-person closing, and you don't want to accidentally cut off that opportunity by thinking that now we're solely in this new remote world of recording things electronically. That can be a totally valid option, but make sure to the extent that you can set it up in a way that feels satisfying for the landowner to try to do that. This is another great place before the closing to remind landowners again to make sure that they're getting their own legal financial advice and that they feel that they really understand how the money part's going to work at the closing, especially if they need to pay for anything or if they're getting paid for anything. And then finally, on the partner front, and Christa and I would include funders and donors in the partner category as well. Very similar to your landowner conversations, you want to make sure that your partners know what the time frame is, that you have a shared set of expectations around the financial piece, that you're trying to collectively build momentum and excitement. Because as Christa mentioned, most conservation projects, they take a while. They can take a number of years. So you want to try to do what you can to build momentum so that when you get to the closing, it really feels like you're capping that experience in a meaningful way that reflects all the energy and time that went into it. Another thing that Christa mentioned that we wanted to reinforce is the importance of having a communication plan with partners so that you know upfront how everyone wants their role to be respected after the closing. So how are you sharing credit? How are you making sure that in the way that each partner talks about the project down the line, from signage to press releases, that any other project, if they come up, partner, if they come across that, you want everyone to feel good about what they're seeing and feel like, okay, like this does justice to our collaboration as a whole. Okay, now Krista's gonna talk a bit about the closing itself.
All right, I need to unmute. Sarah said, yeah, there used to be a time pre-pandemic really when almost all closings were done in person, and it was very exciting, and you felt like, you know, all your work was culminating in this one day when people sat down and actually signed things. And often that really, even when it can happen now, it often doesn't, because people lead busy lives and it's just easier to do things remotely. And we have so many more ways of safely doing electronic signatures and passing money around that doesn't involve an actual check. So it can feel really anticlimactic when a project closes. And I know I've been involved with so many projects where a town meeting vote happens and everybody who went to town meeting and voted for it is like, yay, it's done. And you're like, no, we still have like a year to go. And especially now too, with CRs taking so long to review, when you have a project where maybe the land is purchased, you might not actually be able to close out the whole project internally until the CR is done. And by that point, like everybody's kind of forgotten about it. Laura just sent me a message in the chat that another project we had worked on just closed today. And I was like, oh my God, I thought that finished a long time ago, but it was just the CR just got recorded. So that, I think that's another important point about the communications is, making sure that that you're communicating well throughout the project so that the expectations are firmly established, and that after the facts, people aren't saying like, well, wait, you said this was going to happen, you said that was going to happen. Having a very clear message about what the project is and what's going to happen at closing and post-closing is really important. I wanted to talk a little bit more kind of about the attorney role and particularly, I love Sarah's metaphor of the attorney landing the plane, because there have been so many projects where we get to within 2 weeks of closing, and I'm like, SVT had a great attorney that we worked with for many, many years, and she's still working with SVT. And it was just always such a relief to just hand everything off to her to kind of take it across the finish line, because a lot of times there's a real flurry of activity. And it's often, that point, you're just, the lawyers are communicating with one another, and it's just not as efficient to kind of keep all the partners involved in the minutiae, especially, even when you're good and you do your due diligence and you do your title work at the very opening of the project. Title things can still come up over the course of the project, and sometimes they're being resolved right up to the last minute, particularly when you're dealing with families where there's, maybe been a death in the family, maybe there's a trust and things are getting shifted around on the family side, and that affects kind of title at closing. So it is really good to have an attorney that you trust and work with. And, there's so much esoterica when it comes to the sort of the legal aspects of these deals, but I just want to tell everybody to not be shy about asking questions when you don't understand something. So one of the things that the closing attorney, well, first of all, you need to establish who the closing attorney is going to be if there are multiple attorneys. And sometimes the landowner is maybe trying to watch their budget, and they might be happy if you have the land trust attorney be the lead closing on the attorney. Sometimes their attorney wants to have more control. So that's something that is pretty easy to establish. And then whoever the closing attorney will generate a closing agenda, and that lists all the documents that you're going to have to need to close. It's not just the deed, it's not just a CR. It's all these kind of random things that you may have come across when you bought your house, but maybe not. And a lot of them are just sort of standard forms, but you have to know who's the appropriate person to sign them for your organization. If you're on that side of the transaction, and make sure you have plenty of lead time for that. And then if it's a transaction where there's money changing hands, the attorney will have to also generate a settlement statement. Sometimes it's pretty simple thing that they type up, and it just shows where the money's going from side to side in the transaction. But sometimes it's a very complicated document that comes from the Housing and Urban Development HUD, the HUD thing. In 20 years, I still do not know how to read one of those things. But it's important that you try. And if you don't understand it, ask your attorney to just kind of walk you through it, because it has a lot of small boxes and very small type and lots of numbers that are not, to me, are not intuitive. So, but that shows how the money is flowing, and it's not uncommon to have to redo them multiple times, because there's so many little fees and charges that can come up on a complicated transaction. And those statements really have to be kind of down to the penny. So you often have multiple versions of them. Document version management can sometimes be a challenge at the end too. And I don't have any good advice on that, because I think everybody just, it's kind of like managing other documents in your life. You just kind of need your own system to keep track of what the most current one is. And usually the lawyers are pretty good at that. So, and then there's, sort of again, as I said earlier, there's sometimes memorandums of understanding. This is the time when you want to go back and look at those agreements that you signed way back at the beginning of the project, make sure that you're doing everything you said you were going to do. If you're not, that everyone's in agreement about why you're not doing them or what might have changed. And then, when there is sort of a closing by mail or it's remote, sometimes you're dealing with a landowner who, maybe isn't really that involved with the property. Maybe they live in California. Maybe you've never even talked to them. Maybe it's all been through the lawyer. And that, it's still important for the land trust. We want to make sure that people know about the work that we do and celebrate these successes. So it's still important to try to celebrate that some way. And but it's also important to let them, even if the landowner doesn't really seem to care that much, to kind of let them know, hey, we're going to talk about it this way. We're going to put this in our newsletter. Is it okay to use your name? Is it okay to use your family's name? How do you want us to refer to this property? So making sure those, and it's not always easy. I mean, sometimes you just get people who just don't respond, and then you do what you can, and you sort of take that as a tacit agreement, maybe. But to do your best to try to make sure that everyone's on the same page with how you celebrate. The picture on the left here is from a closing, the project I mentioned that we did in Callahan State Park with DCR. And working with state agencies is so great when it comes to the closings, because they always do the press releases. They always have like important people. We have our state rep was there, and he's standing next to the Secretary of EEA, Katie, she at the time. So it was like this great event that, DCR kind of handled the whole thing. And it was really nice for the landowners to have these giant scissors to cut the ribbon. But, we've done similar things when it's just been SVT doing a closing. And if there's no kind of actual closing to have a celebration around, think about what are your other, stewardship milestones. Are you going to be putting up a kiosk? Are you going to be opening up a trail? And maybe that becomes the public celebration. The picture on the right here was a project we did in Framingham that, I can't remember. Yeah, the closing I think was kind of a nothing closing, but then we got the mayor out. We did a ribbon cutting on the trail, and all these people came out and walked the trail, and we had cider and donuts, and it was great. So there are many ways that you can kind of pause and reflect on what's happened, and thank all the people that need to be thanked. We had a lot of donors to this project on the right, and so all those people were invited to this project, the celebration, and sharing all of this on social media, because there are a lot of people that aren't going to be able to come to an event. So just trying to get the word out as much as you can. And I lost the last thing I wanted to say. Sometimes you're so tired at the end of a project, and it can feel like, sometimes I'm just going to be honest and say that sometimes you don't like the people that you were partnering with at the end of the project. Like you give it, not that you don't like them, but you're just really tired of being with them. And sometimes it's different. Sometimes you feel like you're all part of a family. But it's okay if you have to take a little time away and kind of, because no matter what, you'll always look back and be happy and appreciate the people that you work with, even if you needed to take a little break from everybody. But so, so if the celebration doesn't happen immediately, that's okay too. Because I think we live and die by these timelines and these deadlines and all these things that we have to do to get a project done. And we think that our audience is paying attention to all those things too. And they're really not. And people are just like happy to go out and walk the trail whenever it's ready for them to walk it. And, so we can celebrate our successes anytime. It is kind of better to do it while you have the momentum that Sarah talked about, but it's okay, because the conservation land will always be there and people will always be happy that it's there. So I think that's all I had to add about the closing. Was there anything else you wanted to add on, Sarah?
Not for the closing, for post-closing, which is
Closing, yes.
that's great. Candid reality check from Christa about how these things can functionally, happen and feel. So you've had the closing, great. As Christa said, you want to celebrate, you want to thank and acknowledge your landowner in a way that feels appropriate and comfortable for them. After the closing, if there's any potential tax incentives, so if you worked with someone who did a bargain sale or a donation, there are some things that your organization is responsible for doing in a pretty tight time frame. So even within a couple days of closing, the gift acknowledgement letter is one example of that. And to the extent that you can prep the landowner and prep other folks in your organization to anticipate any tax related paperwork that might be coming down the pike, that's always good. So you're trying to minimize the chance that people are caught off guard that, oh, I forgot I was going to have to review this appraisal and figure out signing this tax form, this 8283 form, which is a whole separate workshop. But you want to wrap your head around other post-closing tax benefit things as soon as you can. And another piece that is important is if your landowner is if you did a conservation restriction and your landowner's primary point of contact for the organization is changing from you to someone else who's more directly involved with stewardship, at a bare minimum, you want to let the landowner know that that's going to happen. But even better if you can facilitate that introduction, because this really, the closing marks beginning of one chapter, the start of a much longer chapter, much longer relationship, hopefully between that particular landowner and your organization on the stewardship side of things. Again, echoing what Christa has said, it's super important to thank your partners, celebrate with them, share credit. This is the part where I also mentioned that we talked in the pre-closing section about how it's smart to have a plan for how you're going to share credit. It's even smarter if you then use that plan. I screwed this up a couple of years ago. We were doing, I think it was our first full-on pandemic closing. We were acquiring a conservation restriction that was going to be co-held with another land trust. We came up with this whole plan for how we were going to share credit anytime we did any type of public press. Great. Then I became so single-mindedly focused on the closing that once it happened, I totally failed to remind the other people at Mount Grace who were writing the press release that we had that communication plan. And then I failed to prioritize reading the draft of the press release before it went out into the world. So it went out and it was entirely Mount Grace centric, which wasn't great. And obviously was our partner was disappointed and surprised and hurt by that. They felt bad. I felt terrible. And it was this totally avoidable hiccup that lined up perfectly with when we should have just been having like the equivalent of a group hug, like, yes, we figured out how to do a closing in a pandemic. So this is just a reminder. Hopefully your relationships can withstand hiccups, but learn if you can from my hiccup and yeah, hopefully you can learn from that. I certainly did. I won't forget how it felt to cause a partner some negative feeling about a project. So have plans and then remember to use them, I guess, is the main idea there. On the stewardship side, and there are folks in the call like Laura, Laura I think is one of the queens of stewardship in the state. So she would be curious what she would think about this topic. But from my point of view, after a closing, try to anticipate and make sure that you're handing off the project in a workable format for whoever's going to be tasked with stewarding that property. This can relate to record keeping and archival policies. It can also relate to things like the state of your mapping system. So there's not really hard and fast requirements about how you clean up GIS shape files, for example, which I think is exactly why at Mount Grace, we don't do a great job of cleaning up our GIS files. It doesn't get prioritized. So in the course of doing a project, I might make, 28 different shape files of a property. And then a few months later, our poor stewardship manager has to open that file and go, what the heck are all of these? Which ones do I use? There are easy ways to try to fix that, but it takes time to prioritize that. So you're cleaning things up to make it easier to hand them off. Christa touched on this a little bit too, but another important thing to do after a closing is to remind yourselves what you may have signed up for stewardship wise in the course of writing grants. So for example, if you promised that you were going to put in a bench, put up signage, put in a kiosk, make sure that your stewardship folks know that that is something that they need to do and they know the time frame in which it needs to happen. Ideally, they were part of those conversations from the beginning anyways, but just be mindful any information that's pertinent that you need to hand off to stewardship staff or volunteers, that you're really prioritizing doing that. And then finally, on the project management side, super important to reconcile your budget. If you had funds, for example, come through at closing that are dedicated for long-term stewardship, make sure that the funds actually get deposited into the right stewardship endowment account or however you've set things up. And this also relates directly to prepping and then submitting for reimbursement if you did end up getting one of those state grants. And this is a place where I like to try to pause and step back and imagine myself as the grant administrator and think about how I can assemble my reimbursement package in a way that's logical and concise, because I can get tunnel vision and think of these projects as like my babies, and I know everything about them, but I have to remind myself that what's obvious to me, because I've been really in this for months or years, there's no guarantee that's going to be obvious for anyone else. And I want to do my job to make it easier for the state grant administrator to do their job, which is a win-win, because then hopefully we get our reimbursement faster and then everyone is happy at Mount Grace too. And then finally, archive the project. And the less time that can go by between the closing and when you're actually doing the archival, the better. I say that as a pep talk also to myself, because I'm pretty terrible at prioritizing this, because we'll finish a project and then I'm tempted and sometimes needing to jump right into the next 5 projects or something. But it is so important that we follow our record keeping processes and we get things in good shape as soon after the closing as we really can, because these deals are supposed to stand the test of time, last in perpetuity. We know that there's turnover within our organizations. We have to be tight about how we're storing documents on site, off-site, in digital format. So just do the archival, even if it's tedious and you hate it, which is my assessment of that activity. It's super important. And the final thing that I'll mention before we go into questions and then Christa wraps things up here is just something that my first mentor at Mount Grace, Jay Raskew, shared with me, which is the idea of trying to be unflappable. I still don't know if that's a real word or something that he made up, but it stayed with me. The idea is that at some point in doing these projects, doing closings, something weird is going to happen. You can bank on it. Something is going to go sideways. You're going to have to pivot to adapt, but that's okay. That's normal. That's expected. And you will figure it out, even if in the immediate moment, it doesn't feel that way. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and see where we are. There's another question from Carol: using landscape conservation software for organizing documents. For Mount Grace, we did transition to using landscape maybe 1.5 years, 2 years ago for stewardship and doing monitoring visits and baselines. I wouldn't say that we are fully utilizing the document organization storage capacity of the program. Christa, would you add anything to that?
We at SVT, we used, we had a couple different databases that we used over the years, and then most recently switched everything over to Salesforce platform, and we used the Locate software that was an add-on to Salesforce that was developed specifically for land trusts. So it was more about keeping contact information, notes on projects and stuff. You can store documents or link documents through it, but we hadn't quite gotten to that point yet when I left. But our development team was also transitioning to Salesforce when I was leaving. So we had everything in one place, which was great because we had previously everybody was using kind of different platforms.
If anyone else wants to unmute and ask a question, that'd be great. I know we have a couple minutes anyways before we close this out. Would anyone add anything to this? Anyone who had a different experience, or were there things that you hope we would cover that we didn't, that you want to throw out there? And Christa and I can try to think about and maybe put together some resources for if we can.
Well, Jane asked, can we review what documents, resources we'll be passing on? So we have the grant spreadsheet. We have, we had a list. Hold on, I think I can pull that up. The Mount Gray's phased document for project management that I think Sarah said she still has to clean up. Was there the 8283 letter?
Yeah, we had links to the Form 8283 and a couple of links to resources that spell out tax benefits, because we didn't have time to get into that tonight, and the funding piece, but there are a lot of groups that have great resources.
And for people who don't know what the 8283 is, it's the IRS form that a landowner has to file with their tax return for the a charitable gift. And so you have to have the appraiser sign it, the land trust has to sign it. And the land trust, it's good practice to always review the landowner's appraisal before you sign off on that CR to make sure you feel the value is supported. Let's see, I also included the SVT sample communication plan and a sample memorandum of understanding. And then I think Sarah put it, we'll have the appraisal policy for 8283s, like I just mentioned. So SVT has a similar policy where we tell the landowner in advance, we're going to request to see the appraisal before we sign off on the 8283. And then a gift acknowledgement letter. Sarah was going to share one of Mount Grace's. So and there's often two gift acknowledgements when it comes to a land deal. You've got the acknowledgement for if it was a bargain sale or gift of land or CR, you have to acknowledge that. And then if the landowner made a gift towards a stewardship endowment, that would be a separate acknowledgement letter. I see Rob has his hand up, and then we have another question about stewardship, calculating stewardship endowment, which I'll get to. But Rob, what do you have to ask?
Just wanted to say thank you. And as a project management professional, that was my consulting specialty around the world. I just want to say the for everybody's benefit, the organization that we saw presented here today is excellent, and use it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So stewardship endowment, and I'll talk about how SVT calculated ours, and then I'm sure Sarah can talk about how Mount Grace does it. So on the sample, we're also going to include a sample project budget, and for SVTs we had two tabs, and the first tab is sort of the whole transaction, and then the second tab is what Laura and her stewardship colleagues at SVT fill out, and that's basically, they estimate, they talk to us about kind of what the project entails, and think about how many hours it's going to take them to monitor if it's a CR, what do they anticipate the enforcement is going to be like if it's a very complicated boundary, if there are a lot of neighbors. So there are all these different factors that go into them. They're thinking about how much time they're going to have to put in to manage and monitor the property into perpetuity. The second tab of the spreadsheet has sort of all these places that you can plug in hours and numbers for management projects and things like that feed into the first page of the budget that has all the transaction pieces in it too. And I did simplify our budget template was kind of complicated, so I tried to simplify it a little bit. I hope that I managed to not break too many links, but I think I got them all, so I hope that works for people. But at least it'll be easy to see kind of how it's supposed to work. So, and Sarah,
yeah, just quickly, I do want to recognize that it's almost 5:30. So anyone who needs to hop off for 5:30, we completely understand. Thank you for your time tonight. Thank you, Barbara, for organizing us. Barbara did put a link to the evaluation in the chat. Christa and I are happy to hang out longer and keep answering questions, but want to honor folks who need to end at 5:30. Go in peace. Thank you for being here.
Rita, did you have a question?
No, I just wanted to say I thought this was really good. And just maybe I didn't understand or didn't hear correctly, but your PowerPoints will be in the handout too, right? Because I thought those were very just useful because you really summed it up well. And I actually had to launch off the meeting for a while because I got a phone call about potential upcoming land situations. So with our regional land trust, Sudbury Valley trustees. So yeah, it's all really good. Thank you.
Good luck. Hope it works out. I'll just backtrack a little bit to the stewardship question at Mount Grace. We actually treat it as a fee, not a donation, and we do a flat fee of $5,000 per project. Of that, and it's a one-time thing. Of that, $3,500 goes into our stewardship endowment and $1,500 goes toward legal defense. Okay. Great.
All right. I think
Any other questions?
seeing no other questions, we will close it up. Again, like both Christa and Sarah said, we will get this all together and send it out to you next week after the holiday. So thank you very much for attending. And we hope to have some more series like this in the future. So stay tuned.